You are not required to use all your time. We only ask that you stay within the time you've been given. Well, you've heard the opening speeches. Now it's time for Professor William Lane Craig to make his first response.
Thank you, Stephen, for that very thought-provoking and interesting argument. You remember in my opening speech, I said that I would defend two basic contentions tonight. First, that there are good reasons to think that theism is true. We've yet to hear Stephen's response to those arguments. My second contention was that there are not comparably good reasons to think that atheism is true. Now, Stephen has offered one argument for atheism, basically the problem of evil in an evidential version. Is this a good argument for God's non-existence? Well, I think not. Now, certainly, the terrible evil and suffering in the world is the greatest emotional obstacle to belief in God. But as philosophers, we're called upon to say not how we feel about a subject, but what we think about it. And when I think hard about the problem of evil, it turns out to be extraordinarily difficult for the atheist to prove, on the basis of the evil in the world, that God does not exist. We all know cases in which we permit suffering because we have morally sufficient reasons for allowing it. What Dr. Law would have to prove is that it's impossible or highly improbable that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. But how can the atheist possibly prove that? Maybe only in a world suffused with natural and moral evil would the maximum number of people come to freely know God and find eternal life. You see, on the Christian view, the purpose of life is not happiness in this world, but rather coming to know God personally and so find eternal life. And many evils may be utterly pointless with respect to producing happiness in this life, but they may not be pointless with respect to producing the knowledge of God. Dr. Law would have to show that there is another world which is feasible for God, in which there is a greater knowledge of God and His salvation, but with less suffering, and that's pure speculation. Now, I think Dr. Law's own example of evil God actually proves my point. Now, first of all, it's inaccurate to call this being an evil God, because God, by definition, is a being which is necessarily good. Peter Millikan, professor of philosophy at Oxford University, says what makes the supreme being worthy of worship is not simply his power, but rather his moral excellence. For the supreme being to be an appropriate object of religious attitudes, therefore, he must, above all, be morally good. So you cannot have, literally speaking, an evil God, because he would not be worthy of worship. What you could have would be an evil creator of the universe, who is not God. And I would argue that just as you cannot prove that the creator is evil because of the bad things in life, so you cannot prove that he is good because of the good things in life. The two cases are on a par. Just as good things don't disprove the existence of anti-God, so bad things don't disprove the existence of God. I think Dr. Law's mistake is that he thinks that the theist arrives at the doctrine of God's goodness by an inductive survey of the world's events, and that's simply incorrect. As Michael Bergman and Jeff Brower point out in their response to Dr. Law, traditional theists have never argued for God's perfect goodness by simply inferring it from the existence of some good in the world. Rather, what the theist can do is to present a moral argument, such as I have done, for God as the foundation of objective moral values. And that leads directly to the final point I want to make on this. Moral evil actually proves the existence of God. For we may argue in the following way. Premise one, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Two, evil exists. Three, Therefore, objective moral values exist. Some things are evil. Therefore, God exists. In the end, Dr. Law admits, and I quote, "It's possible that a cogent moral argument along the above lines might yet be constructed. I suspect that this is the most promising line of attack for theists to take." And this is precisely the line that I've taken in my published work. To summarize then, number one, Dr. Law cannot prove that God lacks morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evils that occur. Two, his anti-God objection fails because I agree that the good things in the world fail to disprove anti-God. And three, evil in the world actually proves God's existence because apart from God, there is no foundation for objective moral values. Now, let me say one more thing about animal predation and suffering, since this featured largely in his argument. Number one, animals are part of a broader ecosystem in which the human drama is played out. And such an ecosystem must be balanced if it's to be viable. It is no accident that every ecosystem involves predators of some sort. For example, I also recently saw a program on television about how the Canadian authorities are reintroducing wolves into the wild in Canada. Why? Because in the absence of these predators, the caribou herds were overpopulating because there was no one to pick off the diseased and the aged, and as a result, they were overgrazing and therefore dying of starvation. The predators actually enhanced the survivability and the health of the caribou herds on which they preyed. So that predators are an essential part of an ecosystem. In a world without predators, the insects would soon take over since there would be nothing to eat them, and all the animals would soon die because all the vegetation would be consumed by insects. And once the insects have consumed all the vegetation, they would die off as well. So any viable ecosystem needs to have predation in it in order to succeed. Now let me say one other thing, however, that is a result of recent scientific discoveries that shed remarkable light on the problem of animal suffering. In his book, Nature Red in Tooth and Claw, published by Oxford University Press, Michael Murray explains that there is really a threefold hierarchy of pain awareness. On the most fundamental level, there is simply the reaction to stimuli, such as an amoeba exhibits when you poke it with a needle. It doesn't really feel pain. There's a second level of pain awareness, which sentient animals have, which is an experience of pain. And animals like horses, dogs, and cats would experience this second level pain awareness. But they do not experience a third level pain awareness, which is the awareness of second order pain. That is the awareness that one is himself in pain. For that sort of pain awareness requires self-awareness. And this is centered in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, a section of the brain that is missing in all animals except for the higher primates and human beings. And therefore, even though animals are in pain, they aren't aware of it. They don't have this third order pain awareness. They are not aware of pain, and therefore they do not suffer as human beings do. Now, this is a tremendous comfort to those of us who are animal lovers like myself, or to pet owners. Even though your dog or your cat may be in pain, it really isn't aware of being in pain, and therefore it doesn't suffer as you would when you are in pain. The problem is that we are so often guilty of anthropopathism. That is to say, we treat animals as though they were human beings. We think of the deer in the forest like Bambi, having human consciousness and self-awareness. And this is simply fallacious. There's an actual name for this. It's called the hyperactive agency detection device, the tendency to regard animals as though they were agents. But once we understand the biology of animals, what we see is that God, in His mercy, has spared the animal world the experience of suffering, such as human beings exhibit. So I think that this goes a long way towards solving the problems that Dr. Law indicates. In any case, those 3 points remain. He cannot show that God lacks morally sufficient reasons for the suffering in the world. His anti-God objection fails because goodness in the world doesn't disprove anti-God. And in any case, evil in the world actually proves the existence of God himself.